Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Are You Planning to Fail? The Price of Ignoring Business Capabilities. My name is Ben Chamberlain. I'll be one of the co-hosts for today. Today we're really going to look at how we can establish a more proactive strategic planning process. We're still giving us the ability to react to change, so establishing the agility needed to be able to respond to any disruption as variables or market forces change. During today's session, we'll take a look at 8 key steps to mastering business capability planning. And the importance here is integrating best practices around business architecture and enterprise architecture with strategy execution management capabilities. So we're going to try something different today. I don't think we've done this before. We're two hosts, both with an English accent. My name is Ben Chamberlain. I'm UMT360's Chief Product Officer. Because we'll be looking at both business and enterprise architecture and strategy execution, I'm going to be picking up the perspective of a transformation office, of a PMO, of a portfolio manager. We're also joined by Vernon Smith, who runs our business and enterprise architecture practice, who's going to wear the hat of a business architect and enterprise architect. And as we'll discuss today, it's not just the integration of these two key disciplines, business and enterprise architecture and strategy execution, but also the integration of the personas of the functions of business architecture and strategy execution, whether that's rendered through a portfolio office of whatever flavor. Say hi, Vernon.
Hello, Vernon. Hi, everybody. And you will get a prize for seeing the seamless link between Ben's accent and my accent.
Absolutely. So we will be pausing as usual at the end for a Q&A. So please post any questions you have in the Q&A manager. That being said, let's jump in. We're a little early this year compared to other years, but normally around this time of year, for those facing the traditional kind of annual planning, it is that time of year again where you start to gear up. But does that really have to be as painful as it normally is? Can we establish a process that allows us to proactively manage an ongoing multi-year strategic plan and revisit that plan on a regular cadence? No, just as a matter of fact, or as variables change. It's really about both proactivity as well as becoming more agile in how we make decisions as plans and variables change. So we're going to look at the various high level 2 primary obstacles you must overcome to improve strategic planning and execution. But to me, these 2 obstacles really are about overcoming and becoming more agile as a business. The first is we really need to move from being a disconnected enterprise to a connected enterprise. When you think about any major organization out there, right, it really is just a set of disparate silos: people, functions, products, services, business, IT assets, whatever it may be. So step 1 really is to get a 360 view across the entire operating fabric of your business, so that you can effectively decide on what transformation is needed to reach your strategic goals. And this is where business and enterprise architecture comes in. So moving from a disconnected to a connected enterprise, and we'll discuss more about that. The next is we want to do a better job of deriving the execution directly from the strategy. So we want to be moving from a misaligned to a strategically aligned organization where we're all continuously optimizing our precious resources, both people and money, to maximize value, whatever that may be. So how do we establish a process, one, where we know we're investing in the right things, strategically aligned and architecturally aligned to our overall transformation? And how do we revisit that plan as variables change? Now, another important thing is when we look at any organization out there, there are obviously a bunch of key functions and roles involved in the whole strategic planning and execution cycle. And the key here, even if they don't see it themselves, is to be able to orchestrate and effectively collaborate to be able to become more agile as a business. So rather than different functions coming up with their own models to fulfill their own functions' need, can we come up with an overall composite model that allows everyone to get the information they need to perform their function, but the sum being greater than all the parts, we pull everything together. We're kind of optimizing that strategic planning and execution process across the key participants and roles within that process, so whether it's a transformation office, a portfolio manager, domain PMO, whether it's executives, business architects, enterprise architects, IT portfolio managers, project managers, everyone has a role to play. So I'm going to hand over to Vernon, because when we think about strategic planning and execution, what are some of the top of mind things and imperatives to a business architect and enterprise architect?
Okay, thanks, Ben. So hi everybody. As you probably saw from my photograph, I'm quite old and have been doing this stuff a long time. So these are observations as an architect over the years. One of the first things I'll say is that as architects, particularly as business architects, traditionally we see the big picture, we see the whole thing, but we're not always that connected with how it actually gets delivered. We can plan target state architectures, we can define where we want to get to, but that sort of rubber hits the road, really understanding the execution side of things. We don't always see that quite so well. Flip side of that, it can be frustrating as architects when we are sort of designing where the organization is going, but we're not included in the way that is actually being delivered. So there's two sides of the same coin there, really. Another big aspect of that, when we're making recommendations, architectural recommendations, be they on the technology or the information side or the business, driving up into strategy, optimizing value streams, whatever they may be, we're normally doing that, or we traditionally have done that from a current state to a target state, and we've had the whole sort of holistic connected enterprise view of it. Thinking back to Ben's slide just now, saying one of the problems is the disconnected enterprise. But the missing piece there as architects, we often don't know what is going on in the sort of current change cycle, what is actually being delivered in projects, what's actually being delivered in that strategy to execution part. So we quite often get misaligned and then realign on a periodic basis. And we want to try and get to a more sort of joined up view of that. And all of that can really be summed up by saying, we understand the current state and we want to set the target state, but we need input from all these other players, all of this village that Ben was talking about just now. Everybody has a role to play in it. And part of making architecture, particularly business architecture, more broadly accepted across an organization is that sort of handoff with all of these other roles. Speaking of handoff, I'll hand it back to you then.
Thanks, Vernon. So let's take a look at the transformation office, PMO, portfolio manager, obviously just representative roles here. What are the key challenges around strategic planning? Of course, there are many, and this is not all of them. This relates also to anyone in the business to a degree, the first one at least. We need to ensure we're doing a better job of deriving the execution from the strategy. I'll talk more about that in a few slides coming up. The push from moving to that kind of static annual planning to more of a continuous dynamic planning process, which is key to driving agility. The ability to have the visibility and control so you can continuously optimize your precious resources, both people and money, to maximize value. One of the things we'll talk about to a degree is what we call the trimodal reality. When we look at organizations out there today, it isn't just about executing in one mode, agile or waterfall or whatever. Functions choose their own way of working, which means that we need to be able to establish the minimal enterprise controls to be able to ensure we're driving value while still allowing for different teams to execute in the mode that is right for them. It is a big challenge that nearly every one of our customers are facing. So this relates just to strategic planning at a high level, but to piggyback on what Vernon was saying, when we think about projects, programs, initiatives, epics, whatever manifests the work, these things aren't funded in a vacuum. They're funded to make a transformational change to our business, whether that's to enhance a product, launch a new service, make a change to a capability, an application, whatever it may be. We have to understand that business and technical impact. So having that traceability is absolutely fundamentally important. As we'll talk about later as well, as demand originates outside of an architectural plan, so what I call bottom-up demand, we still want the ability to be able to understand the architectural impact, right? Is there redundancy? And generally, this kind of disconnection between the silos makes it difficult for a PMO transformation office to understand the connected impact of work across the business and IT assets that ultimately it's funded to transform. Of course, there are many more things there. But what we've talked about here is the ability really to see everything and the interconnections between everything. And Vernon really is saying, look, as a business enterprise architect, we no longer want to be in an ivory tower where we're recommending these big transformations. It needs to be coupled with the ability to execute and deliver on those recommendations and make sure as variables change, the plan can be updated too. So it's a symbiotic relationship to a degree. Now, for those of you that are not new to our webcast, you'll see these slides many times, but they stand the test of time. When we work with any organization, we do a lot of work around strategic portfolio management to help organizations derive execution from strategy. We see three key techniques that organizations utilize today or aspire to utilize tomorrow to do exactly that, derive the execution directly from the strategy. In a project-driven investment approach, you tend to define strategy often in a dark room with the key execs. And aligned with that kind of annual planning process, the requests come in, projects, epics, doesn't matter what they are, right? You may build out a high-level business case for these things, and a part of that, do an impact assessment into strategy, and then use semi-sophisticated techniques to prioritize, optimize, and select the best bundle of work. It's a good technique, but the technique in itself is more bottom-up in orientation because the strategy is defined and prioritized in the silo. The work is captured independent of the strategy, then mapped into the strategy to help us select the best of whatever's being teed up. We know we are selecting the best of whatever's teed up. We don't know concretely we started out with the right demand because the demand wasn't generated directly from the strategy. So that is an approach that many folks still utilize today and tends to be aligned with annual planning. As we move to what we call a product and or program-driven investment approach, we really look to try and overcome that one frailty, which is deriving the execution directly from the strategy. So we start with strategies, as I will discuss, decompose down into metrics, we come down to actionable investments, programs, initiatives, funding at the product level, the capability level, whatever it may be. And then from there, we derive the underlying execution. So following this technique, we concretely know that the projects and epics are aligned with the strategy because we came from the strategy to fund an initiative and then break it down by projects or epics or whatever the flow we're following based on the methodology. But still, we're only focused in this middle tier here at controlling the discretionary spend, the project work, right? We are also at this stage moving from an annual planning normally to a continuous planning model. But as we move to product aligned or capability aligned, we really want that connected enterprise view. We want to go beyond the execution and bring in fundamentally the portfolios that we're looking to transform. And Vernon will talk more about these capabilities, applications, value streams, whatever they may be, products and services, right? So we now have a complete picture of our entire business. And we'll be talking more about this product aligned, capability aligned approach through the lens of business capability planning as we step through the next few slides. Now, it's easy to think that, where am I on this continuum, right? The truth is, when I look at organizations today, they could be 1 foot in project driven, 1 foot in product program driven, the middle tier. They could already have business architects, enterprise architects that are focusing on the connected enterprise, but it's not necessarily synergized across the entire organization. The other thing that's important to note is this is not an either or, right? When you actually look at that product aligned, capability aligned investment approach, it's actually a superset of all three. We still should be able to deal with bottom-up project demand, as we'll discuss, and we should still be able to derive the execution from the strategy as well as receiving the execution from the architectural roadmap or plan. So we're going to look at 8 key steps in mastering business capability planning, which brings together the best practices from business architecture and enterprise architecture and strategy execution across these 8 steps. So I'm going to hand over to Vernon for the first 3.
Thanks. Okay, so business capabilities, they're one of the foundational parts of business architecture. And a business capability, it's a slightly flippant name there, the ability to. Typically, a business capability describes what your enterprise either actually does or what it aspires to do in order to, as it says, successfully carry out business operations. Now, what that really means is it's the business on a page. It's a picture of what your business does. And we'll look in a minute at how a sort of well-formed business capability is defined and various other things. But just to be clear, business capability is what the enterprise does. There are other things that sit around that, other things that sort of make up the rest of business architecture. And here's just a few of them. There's other object types, other things in the business architecture world that describe the how and describe the where and the why and the what to and all those sort of things. So in the business architecture domain, for example, we talk about stakeholders and value streams and organizational structure. Lower down the tree, you have business processes, which define the detail of how something is done. You may be interested in locations, where work is done. And then you go across, you see these other colors in our tooling represent different domains of architecture. So we're just starting to touch into the rest of enterprise architecture there with things like a TRM, a technology reference model that represents technology capabilities, information concepts that break down into your logical and physical data structure and describe the information that is of interest to your organization, and applications and suites and all sorts of things like that. All of those things can be related to business capabilities, but they're not part of defining a business capability in and of itself. Okay. So let's have a look at what is a business capability. What is one? How do they look? So typically, in and of itself, a business capability is a relatively simple thing to define. It must have a name. It must have a clear description, and there's a couple of other things you need about it, not much. Typically they are they are always hierarchical. Normally you'd organize them into large groups, and this is an example. This is an example that the Business Architecture Guild have used in the past. Various different folks use different high-level structures, but basically these capabilities you see in the list here are organized into 3 groups. The core is the differentiating part. It's the things that you can do better than your competition, areas that you can improve, areas that define what your business does. Direction setting is the sort of the running of the business, or working on the business rather than in the business. That's where you'd look at your strategy, your architecture, your compliance and risk, all that sort of thing. And then corporate support, which is normally the 3rd area, is, I call it the table stakes. That's probably a slightly demeaning term, so apologies to anybody that works in those areas. However, they are not areas that your HR department needs to be as good as it can be. But unless you're in the business of providing HR services, it's not going to be a business differentiator. Same thing with your legal department. They do what they need to do. So those are the corporate support functions, if you like, or the corporate support capabilities. If we move on one more, there's one more part of defining. And this talks now about the detail of what's in a business capability. So I mentioned this just now, got a little ahead of myself, sorry. A unique name, a meaningful description, and a place in the hierarchy. That's the business capability in and of itself. What brings richness to business architecture is being able to associate other things to a capability and to define more richness around, so more detail around it. And we do that in 2 ways. You can either say, put extended properties onto business capabilities. And what I mean by that is you can say relative to others, what is its strategic importance, or various other things like that. But that's something you would do fairly rarely. Normally, you would enhance a business capability by associating it with other things. That's what the connected enterprise is all about. So what we're talking of here is, where is this capability used? What information does it act upon? All those things that were on the previous slide that we looked at, with a little picture with the lines coming out, this is where it all comes together. All of these things that you need to know about a business capability in order to give it a place in the architecture. And once it has a place in the architecture, and once it can be defined in that context of the architecture, you can start looking at, why would you need to improve it? How much do you want to improve it? In what dimensions should you improve it? And that can provide an input into the strategy execution side of the house. Okay, let's move on to step 2. So I don't think we need to say anything further about this slide. That's just to sort of keep us where we are. All right, so step 2 is integrating, connecting the capabilities to other portfolios and entities. So the term entity is one that is familiar to the PMO world and the strategic portfolio management world, it means a slightly different thing in architecture, which is why we use those two terms there. But basically, this is what I was talking about just now. Starting to join all these things up. So to join your business capability to the value streams where it plays a role. That's a way that you can see how efficient or how effective the business capability is. Is it used consistently? To look at what technologies and what applications inform it. That will tell you, is it executed consistently in different parts of the world or different parts of your organization? Who uses it? Which organization units can give you? Did you say that again? Sorry about that. Apparently I said something that sounded like SIRI. I must not do that. What information is it working on? Extremely important for things like regulated organizations and banks. Very important to understand that relationship between business capabilities and information concepts and legislation and regulation and all those sort of things. So yes, that's what this second stage is all about, is taking, once you've got a definition and a catalog of basic business capabilities, you then hook them up to the rest of your enterprise, to the rest of your business architecture, and it gives you that connected view. And then once you've got that, you can move on to stage 3. Now, appreciate this is not a full-blown webinar about business capability definition. We can do one of those at some point if it's something that folks would be interested in. Please let us know in the chat. This is just a very lightweight overview of what the steps would be. Okay, so now we've got a well-defined catalog of business capabilities in their hierarchy with their nice consistent description. So everybody in the organization has agreed what it is the organization does or aspires to do. We also have our business capabilities associated to other things and defined fully within the or as fully as we need to or as fully as we can within the organization, within the connected enterprise. What we can now do is start asking questions of all of that. So there's a couple of diagrams there. The first one, which is sort of at the back, that's a thing called a business capability model heat map. And what that's doing is showing us, in this example, functional redundancy. Where do we have too many different applications or too many conflicting pieces of technology trying to enable the same business capability? That could be a very strong sign that we need to do some rationalization. It could also be a very strong sign that we simply have different, very, very diverse businesses, and we maybe we need to revisit the capability model and say something that we are saying is one single capability may in fact be two separate ones. But there's a lot of information you can get from that. Those sort of things can form the beginning of a discussion about investment. Same thing on the second diagram there, and we'll come back to that one at the end of the 8 steps. What that one is showing is a thing called a capability maturity assessment. And what we've done there is taken 4 dimensions. You can do whatever dimensions you want. We happen to have 4 there, which is people, process, data, and technology. And we've said how strong or how weak on a scale of 1 to 5 is each of our business capabilities that we're assessing in this particular example in those 4 dimensions. And you can say, where is it now? Where do I want it to be? Because you wouldn't necessarily say I want to be a 5 out of 5 on every dimension, because that would be unachievable in some cases. It would be ridiculously expensive in other cases, but in some cases it may be absolutely essential. So you would say, what is my current state for this dimension in this business capability, potentially in this particular part of my industry or my organization, in this particular geography? There's lots of slices you can put on it. And what is my target? What do I want to get to? Now, once you have those 2 things, once you have where I am and where I want to be in various dimensions, you then have gaps. You can then say, I have these gaps that I need to close. This is where the architects are sort of moving towards the execution now, because they're saying, we see there is a need to raise the technology that supports this capability by 1.2 on our average scale, or whatever it may be, or we feel the business processes supporting it are weakly defined and we need to get more formal and consistent definition of them. All of those things can lead you to gaps that need to be closed, and gaps that need to be closed are input into investments and into projects. I will hand that back to yourself at that point, Ben.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So, basically, what we looked at so far is, the first 3 steps that take us around the kind of business capability management continuum, right? And as Vernon said, right, building that connected enterprise, connected view, and allowing us to understand, our current state versus our to-be or target state. The gap obviously results in investments, projects, initiatives, whatever we want to call these things, that then need to be teed up within a standardized strategy execution framework, right? So we're now coming into the SEM or strategy execution part of these key 8 steps. Now, before jumping into step 4, roadmap, just want to kind of add a little curveball here, right? Strategy execution is not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? There are different methodologies that can be employed based on how organizations want to execute their projects. So it could be 100% agile, it could be 100% waterfall. I would say that when we're looking at pure enterprise strategic planning, even that is too rigorous. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? We want to be able to harmonize across any form of working, because the reality is, and why we call it the trimodal reality, any major enterprise we work with, when you look across the different functions of a business, they may all be executing in a slightly different way, agile, waterfall, and everything in between. And that is the right? I mean, even Gartner has separated the need for strategic portfolio management processes and tools from project execution tools, because we need the ability to be able to harmonize and control the value we're receiving from work, regardless of how it's transacted. And when you have an organization that's relying on different methodologies and different tools, the problem is heightened for the overall enterprise office to be able to establish those minimal controls or lean governance controls, so that they can ensure the execution is aligned with the strategy, and if variables change, they can react, and that can propagate or trickle through to the different investments out there. So may seem a little confusing, but I'm going to try to kind of be in the middle of the road here in terms of how we step through the next things, talk a little bit about different forms of execution, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all to this. Now, this is probably the simplest thing on the road mapping side. What we're saying here is, look, if the architectural plan has resulted in a set of multi-year initiatives to overhaul our operating fabric in line with our strategy, then we should be able to easily communicate that. And a roadmap, there's a lot of buzz around roadmaps lately. The roadmap is a great tool, whether that roadmap is used for kind of myopic execution over the next quarter, or whether that roadmap is used to represent the multi-year intent of an organization. So being able to consolidate these architectural recommendations from an investment point of view to close the gap, right, from the current to the to-be is key. And the roadmaps themselves are a great way to be able to communicate and collaborate on that multi-year strategic plan. And now you hear me say multi-year because we're not necessarily focused on an annual plan, although we can be. We do want to be able to move to a continuous planning model where we can have a multi-year plan and then keep iterating on that within a given planning horizon. Now, when you think about roadmaps, at this level, we just want macro information. What's the high-level intent? What are the key kind of events, milestones that we may see playing out? What are the dependencies, interdependencies that exist between this, right? And not just interdependencies in terms of initiative 1 requires initiative 2, but dependencies back to the operating fabric of our business, capabilities, applications, whatever it may be. So I should be able to slice and dice this roadmap from multiple perspectives, really dependent on the function or my function to the business, a business architect, enterprise architect, PMO, a portfolio manager, whatever it may be. Now, from a technology point of view, obviously we want to get away from building these roadmaps by hand and sharing them. Having a technology or a product that can automate road mapping, easily define, share, and make these roadmaps real time every time based on the latest data set is fundamentally important. So we're teeing up the recommendations here from business architecture so that they can be communicated effectively across the enterprise. So as we move into 5 here, propose, I want to focus on assessing these investments. Now, I want to take a step back because we could sit here and take a myopic view here that, the business architect team, enterprise architect team are going to sort of set the pace by saying this is the stuff that we should be doing, but that just isn't the case, right? We definitely want to understand the architectural plan. We definitely want to see the investments that are foundational to realizing that target state. But we also have to recognize that demand can originate from anywhere. It's not just going to be from the architectural plan. We could have strategic demand being decomposed from the strategy, just like I talked about in that product program driven. Ad hoc demand that comes out of left field, bottom up, whatever it may be. That's just the reality. And that's why I said that the product aligned, capability aligned approach is a superset of the project driven, the product and program driven approach, because again, demand will come from anywhere. And we need to recognize that, and we need to be able to react to that. So obviously, the architectural demand most likely was assessed against the strategic imperatives when it was originated. If we have strategic demand, as we'll discuss, coming directly from the strategy, it has to be assessed against the architectural roadmap for a compliance point of view. And one has to change. Maybe the architectural roadmap needs to be updated. Maybe the initiative needs to be updated as well, or redefined based on that architectural map. And bottom-up demand as well. If bottom-up demand comes in, it should be assessed against both the strategic plan as well as the architectural roadmap for compliance reasons as well. So this isn't just one view of one function. We want to be able to mash up and consolidate all demand so we can understand the strategic impact, the architectural alignment before moving on. Let's spend a little bit of time about how to originate strategic demand. And it goes back to that product program driven investment approach I talked about earlier. One of the fundamental issues in deriving the execution from the strategy is actually fundamentally and effectively communicating the strategy broadly across the organization. So that means you actually start with a clear definition of what your strategic objectives are at the corporate level within different lines of business, and be able to allow them to be discoverable and understandable across the organization so that people can then come up with actionable investments, initiatives, programs, whatever, epics, aligned with those strategies. So definition of strategy, communication of strategy is fundamentally important. Now, strategies should obviously be measurable. So coming up with metrics or outcomes that allow us to assess the goals behind each strategy is also fundamentally important. So clearly defining strategy and then standardizing enterprise metrics or outcomes, both financial and non-financial, is fundamentally important, because as I come down from the strategy to the metric, its next is going to be the investments to move the needle on that metric and that strategy. So we want to derive the execution from the strategy, not impact the execution against the strategy by understanding its contribution. So starting top down versus moving bottom up. And that's the big difference between project driven versus that product program driven approach that I focused on. And so that means that if we have defined our strategy, we have started to standardize and disseminate our outcomes and metrics, both financial and non-financial, relative to that strategy, then people could tee up initiatives or whatever work against that strategy, and then start to build out sort of contribution assessments in terms of what will this initiative do relative to that metric, right? So as we break down into an initiative or a project or an epic or whatever it may be, we can then start to understand the contribution relative to the target of this metric, and we can roll that information up. So as a strategy and metric owner, I can very quickly see, do we have the right work in play at this stage, even to reach the sufficiency of my particular metric and strategy, right? So we're not guessing, we're actually deriving the work to achieve the strategy and metric combination. And we'll invest more if we haven't reached that, and we'll divest if we've reached that, depending on the decisions that are made. So this is fundamentally important, and that key driver of moving from project-driven to more of a product and program-driven investment approach by deriving the work from the strategy. Now, no matter how we're doing this, whether we're doing bottom-up project capture in the project-driven approach, whether we're deriving the major investments directly from the strategy, whether we're receiving investments from the architectural plan, whether we're in 100% agile mode and we need a one-page business case, a light-based business case. The business case is important, and I would argue it remains important as it ever has done The issue with the business case, in my mind, is it has a bum rap, right? Because people are used to a monolithic, painful creation of a business case, which then files in the bottom drawer, often done in Word and Excel and others, and is not used and never looked at, never revisited again. Obviously, we don't want to apply that liberally across our work. What we do want to do is understand the business intent and the value of this investment, because executives and stakeholders don't necessarily care how we're going to execute, but they do care about the value. They do care about the cost. They do care about when they're going to receive that value, right, in terms of the fundamentals of the business case or the business proposition for the investment, regardless of whether you choose to go 100% agile or you choose waterfall or you choose a hybrid approach. So we look at the business case, obvious data we want to capture, descriptive metadata, much like a project charter. We want to understand resource implications. We do want to look at cost estimates. We do want to understand the impact that this work will have on the metrics that are being defined relative to each of the strategies. We want to understand how this fits in. We want to understand the key events and milestones and the dependencies, not just from a project to project or initiative to initiative perspective, but the dependencies as they relate to the broader ecosystem of our portfolio, so capabilities, applications, value streams, whatever it may be. And again, if we're dealing with strategic demand, if we're dealing with sort of bottom-up project demand, yes, we want to be able to score things consistently, but we also want to be able to engage the business and enterprise architects in terms of fundamental compliance to those standards. So being able to do architectural impact assessments and various things to validate that before moving forward is fundamentally important. So we just gather the right information we need to be able to effectively evaluate investments in which we executed in any style or received from any way, architectural, strategic, or ad hoc demand. So of course, there's a lot more to talk about in terms of propose, but I'm going to keep it pretty high level. Now, let's move into funding. So finalizing investment decisions. Again, there's a whole host of things that we can talk about here, but I really want to just focus on funding, as the name suggests here. Now, building on what I said from the business case point of view, we now have an understanding of the impact of an investment from multiple perspectives, the strategic impact, dependencies from a cross-project, architectural impact, schedule, resource, benefits, whatever it may be. So of course, we can run analysis to look at when to do the pieces of work to optimize the value. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of different analyses you may want to do in the deliver stage, but obviously these analyses can be performed throughout the life. But what is fundamentally important in terms of strategy execution is understanding that I'm capturing the key data sets so that I can understand the impact from multiple perspectives at the same time. So if I delay something, what's the impact from a strategy, cost, benefit, dependencies, project dependencies, capability dependencies, whatever it may be, right? So you want to be able to very quickly understand the cross-portfolio impact of any change. But let's dive a little deeper into funding. Let's say we've got to the point where we know what we want to do and how we want to fund it. And we're going to this focusing more on that sort of product and program driven approach. So we're looking more on the right hand side of this diagram as we come down from the strategy, funding, programs, initiatives, products, capabilities, whatever it may be, into the underlying execution. Got to talk around bulk funding today and the benefits of that. So in this diagram here, you can see the benefit of being able to start with the strategy, decompose down, and then fund at this mid-tier level. So whether that mid-tier level is a capability, whether it is a product, whether it is a program, whether it is an initiative, whether it's a combination, it doesn't necessarily matter, because the benefit of this approach is that if we do have that trimodal reality, people executing in different execution techniques across the organization, it allows us to harmonize. So we could, let's say, completely fund the capability, apply funding at the capability level, and then in a pure agile way, allow the capability owner or the product owner to be able to then tee up the epics underneath without a funding no-go at that level. We could have a traditional program, right, where we have just traditional projects underneath. But again, we're funding at that program level and allowing the program manager to tee up the underlying work within the funding guardrails of the program. We could have an initiative, which is being executed in a hybrid mode, both agile and project. Same deal, right? We're going to fund that initiative, apply the governance controls at that level, and allow the initiative owner to tee up the projects and epics within the funding guardrails, right? It's fundamentally important because what we want to ensure as we move to that product program driven investment approach, that we're actually lightening the governance level at the execution. We want to free people up to be able to execute in the mode that they want, agile, waterfall, and everything in between. But we also want to be able to ensure that the stakeholders, the people that need to reallocate funds as variables change, don't lose the wood to the trees. So by elevating funding controls one level up at the capability level, the product level, the program level, the initiative level, understanding the value impact and everything there, so there's variable change, as variables change, funding can be controlled or changed too, and then lightening the governance at the execution level so they can execute within whatever the funding guardrails are of the parent capability, product, program, initiative, whatever it may be. Fundamentally important as we transition from that project driven to more of a top-down way of decomposing work and funding work, right? So exceptionally important for the majority of our customers that are on this transition. Now, obviously there's a lot more to do with funding, but maturing in that regard, moving from project to program product driven is key, certainly as you harmonize across different forms of execution. So next we can look at deliver. Now, I could have come up with a bunch of slides about how we want to track the performance of the different projects, epics, or whatever it may be. But to me, that's not necessarily interesting, and to sort of borrow from Vernon, kind of table stakes and what you would expect. I want to stay at the portfolio level because ultimately that's where strategy execution stays. We do want to be able to harmonize across different forms of execution. We want to be able to roll things up so that we can support ongoing decisions. So one of the big things our customers are working on at the moment is that transition from more of an annual planning cadence, once a year, to that continuous dynamic planning cadence. It's fundamentally important, not just within a single year, but as we look at the broader multi-year strategic plan, be that 18 months, 36 months, whatever that time frame may be. So as part of that, at that kind of mid-tier level, as we just discussed, products, initiatives, programs, capabilities, we want to be able to adjust funding, right? So it's a pretty simple process of being able to allocate funds, because obviously we still need to meet enterprise finance in the middle, and we need to be able to apportion budgets for a given fiscal period. But as the year unfolds, we want to be able to look at reallocating funds for whatever reason. We're not achieving the results. We achieve the results, and we're going to divest in that investment, right? So it's a pretty simple process, whatever the cadence, quarterly, monthly, whatever it may be, where we have original funding allocations at the portfolio level disseminated down by the products, initiatives, capabilities, product programs, whatever it may be. And then we provide the ability to provide releases and take back. Releases where people actually free up funds because they don't need it, right? The biggest challenge for most organizations is people that hoard money within a given fiscal year, in essence, leaving value on the table. So giving the ability for people to release money back if they don't need it, or conversely for the organization to take money back if the value is not being achieved for whatever reason, that is important. And then from there, we want to be able to look at redirect. So obviously, the opposite is there's going to be incremental funding requests, things that were overlooked, and we just need more money to achieve the outcome. So we want to vet incremental funding requests against any net new investment, whether that's coming from a architectural mandate, whether that's coming from a strategic initiative, or out of left field project demand. And when we assess that, so we take the releases, take backs, and then we look to optimize the value across investing more in existing versus bringing in net new, that gives us an update in terms of our overall revised portfolio funding, both from a dollar and headcount. I don't kind of delineate between this. To me, it's people are a proxy for money anyway, and we end up with that revised value. So it's pretty standardized process, but fundamentally important because again, we want to lighten the governance controls on the execution level, but at the same time, we want to make sure the stakeholders don't lose the woods for the trees. So as needed and as variables change, funding allocations can change, and that can cascade down to the execution level. Now, to do that, we want to be able to empower organizations to have different analysis techniques to understand the impact of changes, right? And it goes back to that slide earlier I was talking about in terms of capturing the right metadata so that we can understand the multifaceted impact of any change. So whether we're running analysis on resource capacity planning analysis, whether we're doing multi-year fiscal planning analysis, whether we're doing benefit optimization, or quite often whether we're just modeling an ad hoc change, right? We're going to have to start this new piece of work. What's going to be the impact? Or we're going to delay this major piece of work, or we're going to accelerate this major piece of work, or we're going to start this major piece of work. What's the impact? So the value isn't necessarily the ability to master any particular analyses, resource capacity planning, multi-year fiscal planning, benefit optimization, or roadmap optimization. It is actually the ability to be able to see the cause and effect of any change across multiple data sets at the same time. So if I did this, it impacts my resource availability this way. It's obviously pushing out my cost forecast. I'm actually accelerating my benefit realization time frame, and I'm adversely impacting the date needed by an application or capability because everything is connected. Again, not going too deep into this, but as you build out this connected model, you can run different analyses and, of course, see the impact of change from various perspectives at the same time. Okay, so into measure. So we're now almost through strategy execution. I would say that step 4 and step 8, actually, I kind of did them a disservice because they're kind of 1 foot in, as the diagram shows, and 1 foot out of business capability management strategy execution. So these really are shared steps here. But with measure, our number 8 here, it goes after something that we've all been focused on, which is, okay, look, we invested time to come up with the architectural plan. We invested time to capture the strategic initiatives. We built business cases, and hopefully we didn't file those business cases into a bottom drawer, right? Because we want to come back and assess, did we realize the benefits and outcomes? And if we follow that step of that, of building that business case, whether it's a lightweight one-pager or a more robust business case, depending on the investment philosophy we're following, we have all the information to be able to do that, from the strategy and the supporting metrics where we've been setting the targets, assessing whether we're going to realize those targets based on the current forecast, but also tracking actuals to say, did we actually realize that throughout the life of the initiative? So whether we're in 100% agile execution, 100% traditional execution, the ability to be able to do benefits realization really comes from the definition of the strategy, the definition of the metrics, the impact assessment of the work against the metrics to show the contribution, and then to track against that at the right cadence, whether that's through the life or whether that's at the end of life. It doesn't necessarily matter. Now, I'm not going to get too much deeper into this, but when we look at the strategic side of things, that's one thing. But Vernon talked up front about that to target state and the gap analysis and the need to assess whether we realize the capability improvements and maturity gains. So I'll bring that up to you, Vernon.
Thank you very much. I think you've probably covered it pretty much in what you said just then. But yeah, I mean, really what we're talking of here is just like you want to measure the success and the amount, the benefits from a project, from a program, from a delivery of any sort, you also want to ultimately assess the impact that's had on the architecture. And we have phrases we used to use years ago in architecture about seeding and harvesting, and using recasting the current state from the previous target so that you can do the next iteration of target. We're talking about taking those concepts and making them a lot more dynamic now, because you can continuously be updating these assessments based on the result of initiatives as they finish. As an initiative delivers its value, that has an impact, and that changes the current to be the new current. And then we can measure a couple of things there. One, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? Have we actually achieved what the previous target was? That's useful for learning for the future. More importantly, where do we want to go next? Have we really achieved everything we need to with this particular area of this capability? And can we turn our attention elsewhere? Or is there more work to do here? Because obviously there's numerous capabilities that are all going to be changing and improving simultaneously. There's numerous projects and programs and executions going on simultaneously, and it's that balance between them for the best continuous value. And I never said the word ivory tower once. I think Ben might have slipped it in once, but I think you'll have seen, because this is the last thing I'm going to say on this webinar before we hand it back to Ben. This is about the opposite of ivory tower architecture. This is about engaged, integrated architecture being part of the overall strategic portfolio management, strategic planning, strategy to execution. No delineation. Architecture is a fundamental part of that, and that is a fundamental part of architecture. Back to yourself, sir.
Thanks, Vernon. So, yeah, I mean, so, you know, only an hour's presentation. We kept it pretty high level. I think the value here is these 8 steps, and the value is how, you know, business architecture best practices, coupled with strategy execution best practices, regardless of execution techniques. Obviously, and what you'll see from us is deeper dive webinars on different areas, whether it's deeper dive on business capability modeling. Obviously, it's deeper dive on various facets of strategy execution, whether it's a deeper dive on application portfolio management, whatever it may be, right? There's obviously a huge amount to this, but, you know, think of this more as much as it can be, a kind of paint by numbers way of stepping through and effectively integrating both the business architecture and strategy execution capabilities in that overall business capability planning framework, which, you know, really is going to derive value for the organization and for the functions within the organization. Now, I was thinking about a takeaway slide, but, you know, to me, we've been talking about business capability planning and, you know, how it brings together best practices from strategy execution and business and enterprise architecture, right? And it is to a degree a subset of what we do, which is an overall strategic portfolio management. As an organization, we focus on strategic portfolio management. We see strategic portfolio management as a set of processes and supporting tool sets to drive agility in an organization, agility in decision making to drive business performance. And for us, strategic portfolio management is on the bedrock of business and enterprise architecture and strategy execution. And we're really starting to see that realization now, whether it's through Gartner research, from how they've always talked about integrated IT portfolio analysis being a key part of strategic portfolio management, whether it's on Gartner's look at enterprise architecture, where they're starting to blend the need for an execution arm in association to that. So strategy execution is becoming more and more important. It just makes a lot of sense. Now, obviously, it says transformation office here is probably left over from an old slide. Now, anyone involved, whether it's business architects, enterprise architects, transformation office, PMO, need the right tool sets to be able to automate that. And that's where 360 Strategic Portfolio Manager comes in, because it helps you build that composite model, so then different functions can then interrogate that model and data set in the views that they want. When we break down 360 Strategic Portfolio Manager, it really has 2 key modules, and no surprise, these modules align to the kind of capabilities and processes we've been talking around. So Enterprise Connect, which is all about moving from disconnected to that connected enterprise, that brings all the business and enterprise architecture best practices to bear, some of which Vernon talks about today. And Portfolio Insights really deals with the strategy execution capabilities. And interesting, because when we first start working with a new customer, we may enter in different functions. We may start with business and enterprise architecture. We may start with a PMO or transformation office from a strategy execution point of view. But the story just gets better as these worlds come together. So the modules themselves can be deployed independent of one another. Start with business architecture, start with PMO. They can be deployed incrementally. So start with Enterprise Connect with business architecture, and then move into enabling strategy execution capabilities, or can be deployed in a big bang, right? So both together as a holistic strategic portfolio management solution. So I think we're closing in on time. There's about 4 minutes to run. First, I want to thank you for your time today. having two people present seemed to work out, so we might do that again. No, if you want to learn more, then obviously go out about anything we do, strategic portfolio management, solutions, products, the framework we utilize in terms of helping maturing organizations, business and enterprise architecture and strategy execution processes. No, just go to the website, and there's many things that you can reach out to us on. And join an upcoming webinar. We will probably take a little bit of time off over the summer, come back with vengeance in September. So be watching out for the next webinar in the series, where we kind of look at best practices in business and enterprise architecture, best practices in strategy execution, and as today's webinar was an example of the handshake between the two disciplines, where you get that multiplier. Okay, well, we're on time, so again, appreciate you attending today's session. I hope you found it valuable, and look out for the next. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks all for your attendance. Thank you.